So I'm talking about how our lives are governed, sort of a general, why do things happen to us the way they happen kind of topic. That's my subtitle here. Why things happen the way they happen. And this was very much inspired by thinking about the fact that we happen to have had 4 beloved people leave our congregation within the space of a month. And it just sort of invites, why does the Lord do things the way he does kind of questions. And, mostly we can imagine that in cases like this, he's really got it under control, and it doesn't feel wildly out of control, but it just still is a occasion to wonder why. What are some of the reasons for the things the Lord does? And the overarching or overwhelming thing that the Word has to say about this is that the Lord has got it all in his hands. He's got it all under control. He's got even the tiniest details. And so this is the quote I've been sort of leading with. Can you read that all against the background? It says, "The Lord foresees what kind of life someone's going to lead and how he's going to allow the Lord to lead him. And since every single thing, even the smallest, is foreseen, it's also provided." And that's sort of the overarching idea, that the Lord has foreseen and provided even the tiniest little details of our lives. And that's why I have this path image here. He's got a path for us, our own path for each of us. And if we're lucky, it'll look like that. Although, as I'm about to say, of course, none of it's about luck. Something that comes up when we dig into this kind of stuff, the why things happen the way they happen, is that some of the teachings are actually are challenging or difficult because, bad things happen, and yet here are these quotes saying, but that the Lord's got it all under control, and it can be really hard to reconcile. The Lord is foreseeing and providing every smallest thing, and there are still tragedies and heartbreaks. And sort of the bottom line is, yeah, that's hard, and we're trying with a microscope to see a mountain, and it's just hard for us to get it. And we have to be really careful looking at these passages that never to sort of forget the bigger context of the Lord loves us and he doesn't want bad things to happen to us. He never wills bad things to happen to any of us. It was occurring to me as I was preparing this that I can sort of draw an analogy with a surgeon. If you had no idea what a surgeon was or what a surgeon was supposed to do, it would be a bad idea to watch a surgery. You'd say, why is he drugging people and stabbing them with knives? This is violent crime. And we can have, that can be an analogy of us looking at providence. Like, what the Lord does can look very strange to us because we don't understand the purpose. And yet, there is this overwhelming, overarching message of peace, that the Lord has this, that the Lord has our lives, that he wills us good, and that everything that happens is being fitted into this path. It's contributing to our path towards something good. Now, one of the most, sorry, I always mean to encourage people before I get too far into it to please interrupt me, all the more so if it's a subject that's actually close to your heart. Yes?
Jared, your song right at the opening there. The steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord.
Yeah.
That's always been important to my own thinking. It's beautiful because it just says so much.
Yeah. And I chose that psalm for that passage. Yeah, the steps of a good man are ordered by the Lord. And there's a lot in that psalm about providence. A little that a righteous man has is better than the riches of the wicked. Statements like that. but yeah, the overall reason I chose that psalm was for that quote, which I will definitely come back to. Yeah. So one of the big things that we're taught about providence is that we're not supposed to, and in fact not allowed to, understand it all. That's the fifth law of divine providence. It's a law of divine providence that a person not perceive or sense anything of the operation of divine providence, but still know about and acknowledge it. So it is a law of divine providence that we not see too clearly how the Lord is governing us. And there's some very good reasons for that. The first is that we wouldn't feel free. If a person were to perceive and sense the operation of divine providence, he would not act in freedom in accordance with his reason, nor would anything appear to him to spring from him. So too if he were to foreknow events. Secondly, if we saw divine providence, we would try to take the reins, we'd try to take the wheel, and it wouldn't go so well. It would be like someone off the street telling the surgeon, I can do that better, except it would be even worse than that. So if a person were to clearly see divine providence, he would inject himself into the order and course of its progression and upset and destroy it. And the third point is sort of a combination of those two. If a person were to clearly see divine providence, he would either deny God or make himself God. So if we saw what God was doing, we would end up either saying, forget it, get out of my life, I don't want you, or we would say, stop, I can do that better. We'd either deny God or make ourselves God. It's kind of one of those, one or the other. But that said, we're told that it is granted a person to see divine providence from behind and not from in front, and in a spiritual state and not in a natural state. So there are things we can see, just not on the cutting edge of it as it unfolds. And that's what I'm looking at tonight, places where we have teachings about the ways divine providence works and the way the Lord looks at our lives that we can see insofar as we're in a spiritual state. There's a nice passage here that gives an illustration of why we can't see divine providence. It says that a person sees nothing of this universal providence, and if he were to see it, it could appear in his eyes only as scattered heaps and assembled piles of materials to passers-by, the material out of which a house is to be built. But to the Lord it appears as a magnificent palace, constantly being built and enlarged. So we see random events, we see random choices people make, and we don't see where it's going. We don't see the purpose, the overarching plan. The Lord looks at those very same scattered events, and he sees what he is building out of it. So we can see the pieces. We just don't know how to put them all together necessarily, not the way he does. And getting on to the luck thing, this passage has always stood out in my mind as an illustration of just how completely providence is present in our lives. And it says, everyone knows luck is a thing. Everyone knows that luck can, win you games or lose them. And it says, take dice and playing cards, or talk to people who play. Do any of them deny the existence of luck? For they play with it wondrously, and it with them. Who can succeed against it if it's adverse? Does it not laugh at prudence and wisdom? When you roll dice or turn over cards, does it not seem to know and direct the rolls or turnings of the wrists to favor, for some reason, one player more than another? And just last night, I was playing a game with my brothers that involves a lot of dice, and I rolled 2 20-sided dice looking for high rolls, and I got a 3 and then a 4. And then he rolled 3 6-sided dice and got 3 6s. This is a silly example, but and the thing is, I have known for a long time that I, generally speaking, have bad luck at dice and cards, and he, generally speaking, has good luck. That's just, you can't put your finger on it. He still gets bad rolls, but he just has good luck. And what is that about? What magic juice does he drink? But it's a thing. It's very much a thing. And if you play enough, it's kind of inescapable. Play this kind of game. And the point this passage is making is, obviously, this isn't luck. Luck is not some amorphous force. This is providence. This is the Lord's hand, believe it or not. And, oops, the wrong way. Since providence is active in the least particulars of such unimportant and trivial affairs, how then not in the least particulars of affairs not unimportant or trivial, affairs that are matters of peace and war in the world, or salvation and life in heaven? If you let that sink in, that every time you pick up a die and throw it, the result is not accidental. And that's sort of staggering. And if the Lord has that kind of presence in the things that happen, well, of course, then he's present in things that actually matter. And of course, that can lead our minds to say, so how is there free will then? How is anything up to us then, if the Lord has got that kind of control? And there's a great passage from the spiritual experiences, or the spiritual diary, as it's sometimes called, that gives what I think is a really cool illustration of this. Basically, Swedenborg describes a conversation he has with some spirits who think sort of the way I just described, that things are inevitable, that there's only one possible outcome, and everything is proceeding along sort of this foreordained juggernaut path. And so the passage goes, I spoke with spirits concerning providence, and some also were present who believed somewhat in fate, and it was shown them how the case stood. They supposed that all things were accomplished out of absolute necessity, and thus that the whole life was the unavoidable force of circumstance, consequently that the Lord was bound by necessity, therefore that there was nothing except this to keep things in existence, and that this is the divine. But they were shown that they have entire freedom, and if freedom, then there is not necessity, because there are so many contingencies which bear a person in freedom to opposites. So, I could have a dramatic experience tomorrow, my car could crash, and that same experience could conceivably lead me to the depths of hell or the heights of heaven, because there is no one outcome that where one course things have to follow. The same event can lead different people in different directions. And the passage goes on. This was exhibited or illustrated by means of pebbles, which were so placed as to form a certain figure. And then if necessity required that one pebble should be placed in order after another, and thus that a person should arrange them from necessity, nothing further would follow. But it was shown that the case is this, that the pebbles are put now here, now there, so as to appear dispersedly, and this according to freedom. And the Lord foresees the form, namely that in which a person from freedom wills to arrange his life. But he determines for him from other considerations, and so foresees the form, and permits him to go hither and thither, so that the moments of his life appear like scattered pebbles. But the Lord then sees whether he fills up the spaces between them. He sees what's lacking and where, and then continually what is next in order, after 100 or 1,000 years, and so forth. And I know that's a lot to digest, but I took a stab at illustrating this myself. So here is a figure arranged in a certain pattern. These little dots, they're your pebbles. And we're putting them down in a certain figure. And it's obvious what this is supposed to be. It's a smiley face. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is your divine foreordained lot. You get a smiley face if you happen to be one of the lucky ones, or a frowny face if you are predestined for damnation. and those are your choices, right? Smiley face, frowny face, smiley face, frowny face. And our only choices are to complete the pattern, to put the next pebble in the figure. This is the way that some people imagine providence has to work. And obviously the point of this is that it's wrong. This is completely wrong. Our life, we don't have some sort of scheme that we're conforming to. We make rather random decisions, like scattered pebbles. A bit here, a bit there, high, low, hither, thither. There you go. And it doesn't look like much. But the Lord he sees all those dots, and he sees the picture they could become. He sees that they're going to become eventually, if we keep adding pebbles, an incredibly intricate and unique picture. And so for illustration's sake, I don't know how well this is going to show up, there's a picture, and you can see that each of the pebbles is lying somewhere on the outline of that drawing. And it's a scary lion. But of course, those same dots didn't have to make that picture. So without moving the dots, you can make a different picture. And this is just a clumsy little illustration, but I hope it sort of gets the point across that the Lord never moves our pebbles. We get to put them down. He never overrides any decisions we've made. And yet, even within our complete freedom, he has an incredible range of options, as it were, and an incredible power to bend us towards the scary lion or the lovely lamb or any number of other things. And it's, so there's this sort of fascinating harmony of his total control and our freedom, our total freedom. And our opening passage really kind of gets at that. It says, the Lord foresees what kind of life someone's going to lead and how he is going to allow the Lord to lead him. And I love that it says allow. The Lord is working, has got all the variables in his hands. And those variables are not just, static things. Those variables are our choices for all time. He's got all of these things in his hands, and he's working with our choices. Any questions at this point? All right, I can just keep plowing on. So this is sort of the Lord's message about providence boils down to, as I keep saying, he has it in his hands. As he says in the gospel, are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin? Not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not fear, therefore, you are of more value than many sparrows. So sparrows are worthless, essentially. And yet they're not. They're not worthless at all. God knows about all of them. The hairs of your head, obviously worthless, but no, they're numbered. The Lord knows exactly how many you have. You could even read that as saying, you have exactly as many hairs as you need. The point is, the Lord has the tiniest details under consideration. And so now getting a little more into where I said I was getting, looking at some of the specifics that were taught about why things happen the way they happen. And there's a passage that talks about why people die when they do. And this is another spiritual experiences passage or spiritual diary passage, and some people hold those kind of lightly. I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. The teaching is the reasons why some die children, some youth, some adults, some seniors are. First, on account of use in the world to people. Second, on account of use while he is in the world to spirits and angels. For a person as to his interiors is with spirits, and he is there as long as he is in the world, in which all things in the spiritual world terminate. Third, on account of use to himself in the world, either that he may be regenerated, or else that he may be led into his evils, lest they lie dormant and afterward break out, which would result in his eternal ruin. Fourth, therefore, on account of use afterward in the other life, after death, to eternity. And just to make that a little easier to see, I cut out all of the explanations, pared it down to just the basic statements of the reasons. And so these reasons are reasons why you might not leave the world when you think you should. The first 3 reasons are explaining why someone might stay in this world. Because there's a use they can serve here to people in the world, because there's a use they can serve while here to spirits and angels, and because there's a use to themselves that they still need to perform. And of course, I've heard many times people sort of wondering, what use am I performing here? Why am I here? I don't feel useful. And this doesn't really explain it in too much detail, but what it suggests is there's a lot of ways of being useful, and we don't know which of those uses we're serving. And then the fourth reason would explain why someone would leave this world, because there's a use to be performed in the other life. And it's powerful to think, right, the Lord is looking at what's useful, and that's why he, and then sort of, that's why he what? Why he kills people? So that's why we have to be so careful with this. This is talking about the Lord looking to uses in the way he governs us, but if you read this clumsily, it's saying that the Lord, that every death is intentional. Even the deaths of children are intentional, and obviously that is not true, that the Lord never wills a premature death or anything like that. Whenever there's a premature death, that's disorderly, and it results in some way or another from something that's not the Lord's will. And that's a huge important piece of context that we have to keep in this conversation. Evil, I don't love this phrasing, but one way you could say it is that evil limits the Lord's options. Whenever evil is in the picture, the Lord doesn't get his plan A, which is that there's no evil in the picture. So whenever imperfect people are making imperfect choices, the Lord's options are limited, but within the confines of his limited options, he's looking towards what's useful. He's trying to see where will serve the greatest use, and he has an awareness of that goes so far beyond our own. On similar lines, why does bad stuff happen to us? Here again, it's really important to remember that it never happens because the Lord wants it to happen. That's the important context, but this passage says something really interesting that I hadn't actually considered that hard before. Swedenborg writes, "Whenever something happened to me that seemed haphazard, the angels told me that it happened because evil spirits were present. And when I suffered some mishap, they said that the sphere of that kind of spirit was prevailing. Evil spirits also discovered how, by the use of the tricks they knew, to produce a sphere from which misfortunes resulted that looked plainly like the products of mere chance." Continuing, the angels went on to say that all things, in fact the smallest of all things, down to the smallest of the smallest, are directed by the Lord's providence, down to the very steps taken by the feet. And there's that steps are ordered by the Lord. And when the kind of thing prevails that is contrary to providence, misfortunes occur. They also substantiated the assertion that there is no such thing as mere chance, and that what seems to be haphazard or fortune is providence at work in the last and lowest degree of order, in which all things are comparatively inconstant. And that's a lot to digest. On the face of it, it's indicating that, when bad stuff happens to you, that's actually the result of a spiritual sphere with you. And that's a big idea to take in. And on one level, it makes sense. It's kind of the karma idea, right? You make bad choices, you get a bad sphere, and that creates bad things. But then there's so many disclaimers you have to throw in. Like I said, the Lord doesn't create bad events to punish you. And it's also not a one-for-one thing, right? If you trip and fall, you shouldn't lie there thinking, okay, what did I do? Oh, it was because I shouted at the dog. It's not a one-for-one kind of a thing like that. And of course, not everything that happens to us is our own doing. Something that my father said that has always stuck with me, though I don't see it taught in so many words in doctrine, is that the reason evil is that it hurts people who don't deserve it. It's called evil because it creates collateral damage. And so some of what happens to us is the result of other people's choices, for good or ill. And that's another powerful thing to digest, that we actually have the power to have an impact on other people's spirits through our good choices or our bad ones. We kind of all knew that, but then when we think about it, it's a staggering responsibility. And then finally, some of the bad things that happen to us aren't really so bad. They just feel bad to us, but they're maybe like growing pains. They're a chance to learn something. And that's suggested in a lot of ways in a lot of places, and I'll just cite this passage as an example. This is talking about regeneration, and it says, the second state is when a distinction is made between the things that are the Lord's and those that are a person's own. Nowadays, this state rarely occurs without temptation, misfortune, and sorrow, which lead to the inactivity and so to speak, the death of bodily and worldly concerns, the things which are a person's own. In this way, what belongs to the external is segregated from what belongs to the internal. So temptation, misfortune, and sorrow are part of regeneration in the sense that they make us realize that, yeah, those worldly bodily things, they did have to die. They do have to be lost, and that feels like misfortune. But it's part of growing. And again, that's not the Lord's will. His will would be that we choose to do what he wants so humbly, so innocently, that it's really not a struggle. That rarely happens nowadays. Nowadays, it takes temptation and misfortune. And even there, the Lord would prefer temptation to misfortune, I think. He would prefer that we face an internal, deal with something internally without having to experience misfortune. But sometimes misfortune is the means he uses to change our perspective, to make us realize that, to invite us to realize that the thing that we were upset about losing wasn't that important or needed to go anyway or something like that. I'm going to pause because I know I've just these are meaty ideas. And any interjections? Yes.
So I guess when we think of bad things, we have to question what we mean by bad things, because from I guess the external person, what appears as bad to external person may not necessarily be bad for internal person. So the perception is being questioned there.
Yeah. Right. So those of you who didn't hear, he said, what is a bad thing? Paraphrasing. We call things bad, but are they in fact bad for us in the long run? And offhand we could probably create a couple categories. There are things that are just bad, that clearly God never wanted. And then there are things that we really dislike that maybe were the best thing that ever happened to us, and there's stuff in between too. And my next slide is a bunch of quotes that are getting at the idea that the Lord's perspective is so different from ours. And that's one of the hardest things to swallow, or hardest things to digest about looking at his providence. What he sees is so different that sometimes the way it feels to us is that he doesn't care about what's important to us. And that's not true. It's just that he has such a different perspective on what's good for us. And if you've been a parent with a kid who really wants more candy or whatever, who's going to die if they don't get the thing that you just confiscated, you can sort of get the idea, right? Kids sometimes have a terrible idea of what would be good for them, and it's really cruel to deny it to them, or they think it's really cruel for you to deny it to them. But the parental perspective is so different. Yes?
A little quip about the farmer whose son ran off, and the neighbor said, "Oh, it's terrible, what bad luck your neighbor's gone." He said, "Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And the son came back with a herd of horses that he had found, and the neighbor said, "Oh, what great luck you've had." And he said, "Great luck, who knows? Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And the son got on one of the horses and fell off and broke his foot. And the neighbor said, "Oh, such bad luck." He goes, "Good luck, bad luck, who knows?" And then the army came by transcripting children to fight in the war, and he didn't get conscripted because he had a broken foot. And the neighbor said, "Oh, good luck, bad," and it goes on. You can go on and on. Is it good luck or bad luck? It looks like good luck, but it turns out it's not. It looks like bad luck, it turns out it isn't either. So.
Right. Right. And it's if you just, instead of luck, say providence. Right. Yeah. Yeah. So this is one I like a lot and say a lot. The Lord says, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." Can feel a little bit like rubbing our faces in it, but you know, how many parents end up saying to their kids, "Because I said so, because I know that I am right, and I know that you are wrong, and I can't explain this to you, so you just have to deal with it." Sometimes it comes to that. Right. Right. Sometimes, and it's their fault too, right? If they would just stop arguing, you wouldn't have to use such. Anyway.
Your mom falls out.
Right.
Yeah, say the same thing she said.
Another one is, the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. And into that you can read, the Lord looks at eternal happiness. And that's what the next passage is getting at. Divine providence regards eternal ends and not temporal ones, except as these accord with eternal ones. And we regard eternal ends sometimes. and I'm often struck and humbled by just how natural my thoughts often are. I go home and I spend a lot of time watching what exactly on TV or whatever, like that was worth my time, but it's what my natural self enjoys in, and it's harmless, but that is so different from having eternal things in view. And the Lord is always looking to something eternal.
Lots of loved ones, though, it's hard to think of, the eternal of it, because we're grounded here, meant to be.
Yeah. And actually that's a good opportunity for me to say, my brief experience of watching other people experience loss is that it really calls attention to the fact that we're works in progress, and there's a part of us that's spiritual and there's a part of us that's not. And without being harsh to people at all, you can say, yeah, that's what we are. There's a part of us that gets it. They're alive. They're happier in the next life. I'll see them again. And there's a part of us that just doesn't get it. Like, why can't I go shopping with them? Why am I not allowed to see them? And both of those things are real, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's if we weren't works in progress, we'd be in the other world. So, it's yeah.
That's the other scary part. If we're still here for a long time, then you begin to think,
You need the
boy, I've
work.
still got an awful lot to
Remember, Urseth, there's three reasons, right? And only one of them was working on yourself. The other two were used to angels and spirits and used to others. Yeah. So.
You're a fine example to the rest of us.
Of what?
We'll see. We'll put the dots together, whether you were the lion or the lamb.
Yes. Sometimes you think the
Somehow
dots are all over
look
the
like
place.
the lion to me, but and so one more area of sort of why things happen the way they happen, and this one is, I think, a little easier, is why some people are rich and some people are poor. And having just looked at all those other passages about eternal perspective, it's easy enough to say, well, that's because it doesn't matter that much. Not in the end. it doesn't matter that much. Passages say things like, everybody's life follows him, whether he be rich or poor, and there's no particular mercy for one in preference to the other. This is answering the sort of old Christian idea that the poor are shown a special preference. He who's lived well is received, while he who has not lived well is rejected. And poverty leads and draws man away from heaven just as much as wealth does. So poverty can be exactly the worst thing for you, spiritually speaking, or it could be a good thing for you, spiritually speaking. Or rather, riches could be a bad thing for you, spiritually speaking. You know, some people might get all tangled up in resenting other people for having more than themselves, and other people might get all tangled up in, you know, greed, hoarding, or whatever. So you know, the Lord is again just seeing things on a totally different scale, and we think it's terribly unfair that some people have more than others, but from that eternal perspective, riches really don't matter except insofar as they affect our spiritual state. And that's why we're told that the angels are totally okay with whatever they have. And this passage says, those who are in a state of innocence live contented with what they have, whether it be little or much, because they know that they receive just as much as is good for them. Those receiving little for whom little is useful, and those receiving much for whom much is useful. They also recognize that they themselves do not know what's good for them, the Lord alone knowing this, for in all things that he provides, he looks to eternal ends. Pretty striking to be that content with any range of what you have. And it should be said that you could argue that this passage is talking about angels in heaven who may have less or more, but one way or another all have enough. I don't think the passage is suggesting that if someone is, you know, destitute and starving, we should tell them, be content with your lot. That's, you know, again, context and perspective, right? And clearly, destitution and starvation are not things that the Lord wants. So that's part of the picture. And then the other part is, riches are not important. Wealth is not important. Yeah.
The last part there is intriguing to me in as much as it's describing the spiritual world. And I think, as natural, that eternal ends means for my, once I get to the spiritual world, hell or heaven, whatever.
Right.
But once you're in the spiritual world, what does an eternal end look like? Like, is there a sense of change and progression up and down that's for your eternal progress? Or because your state is established, essentially. Your ruling law is kind of called out one way or another. It's sort of an intriguing thought.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this isn't necessarily talking about angels. The antecedent is those in a state of innocence. I just say that it's sort of, in the bigger context of that chapter, it sounds like it's talking about angels, but not necessarily. But then, to answer your question more directly, I think that the best illustration I have is sort of a, what's the term for it? Confound it. 9th grade was a long time ago. Not a parabola, the other one. The curve where it's... No. Yeah, asymptotic, where you're approaching and approaching and approaching a line indefinitely, but it will never reach it mathematically. And at the early stages of the curve, it moves rapidly towards that line. And then as the curve goes on, gosh, I should remember more of the terms than this, but anyway, it just goes on and on and on. And it, at a certain point, it appears to be just running parallel to the asymptote, but actually it is indefinitely getting closer, but it will never touch it. And there's something to that in the way our spiritual progression works. On earth, we make these rapid strides up or down, and then there's just a finishing that happens to eternity. But that's that's a very simple mathematical function that obviously doesn't capture it in its complexity.
I think Tevye captured it well when he asked, if I were a wealthy man, would it spoil some vast eternal plans if I were a wealthy man?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and the answer might be yes. The answer might be you would be a rotten person if you were rich, right?
More rotten than I am already.
Right.
Yeah.
And so just one more on this note, a nice short one. Honors and riches are blessings and curses, and it all depends on how you hold them or who you are. And the Lord knows that better than we do. And so all of these ideas, like I said, they can be really reassuring to sort of think that, wow, the Lord understands my circumstances so much better than I do, and He's doing things that are good for me even when I think my life is a mess. And then on the other hand, it can be hard for us to see this stuff and say, what, you think this is good for me or whatever? And that's why I say you hold this stuff kind of lightly. You know, these are fairly isolated teachings, and the overwhelming thrust of all the teaching on providence is it doesn't make sense now. It won't all make sense now, but the Lord has got it, and He really knows what He's doing. And this is a really good passage about that, and it's another one that's really familiar, often cited, but I will read it again because it's so good. Those who trust in the divine are altogether different from those who do not trust in the divine. Though concerned about the morrow, yet they are unconcerned, in that they are not anxious, let alone worried when they give thought to the morrow. They remain even-tempered whether or not they realize desires. They do not grieve over loss. They are content with their lot. If they become wealthy, they do not become infatuated with wealth. If they are promoted to important positions, they do not consider themselves worthier than others. If they become poor, they are not made miserable either. If lowly in status, they do not feel downcast. They know that for those who trust in the divine, all things are moving towards an everlasting state of happiness, and that no matter what happens at any time to them, it contributes to that state. That last sentence is a really strong statement. The small qualifier is not everything that happens to us was the Lord's plan A. But whatever happens, He's leading us. We are on that path He's laid out for us. And turning to that idea of each of us having our own specific path, it's powerful when thinking about providence to remember that His providence is very specific in the sense that He really does have a whole plan laid out for each one of us, our own whole plan. He's getting at this when He says, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. My Father's house there are many mansions, and if it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. I don't actually know if that you is singular or plural in the Greek, but I think it works to read it as a singular you. Each of us has our place. On the same lines, then the word of the Lord came to me saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew your purpose. And then in the heavenly doctrines, a lot of teachings about this idea that we have our place in heaven and no one else can fill it. So heaven has been distinguished into as many societies as there are organs, viscera, and members in the human being. And no constituent in these can be situated in any other place than its own. Consequently, since angels are such constituents in the divine human in heaven, and no others become angels than those who have lived as people in the world, it follows that a person who allows himself to be led to heaven is continually being prepared by the Lord for his own place there. Every angelic person is also assigned to this place after his departure from the world. And this is the inmost object of divine providence as regards heaven. So I may be not quite right about this, but thinking about the human body, at any given point, there are cells missing from every organ, right? There's always a few cells that could be in any given part of your body that aren't. And so the human body can function with missing cells. And if, I don't fill my spot in heaven, well, the grand human will function. But that spot that was for me will never be filled unless I fill it. And it's an amazing idea. And then on Sunday, I talked about Abram being told, look up at the stars, count them if you are able to count them. So shall your descendants be. I talked about the idea that that's the Lord being told, these are going to be the angels of heaven. Stars represent angels. Count the stars if you are able to count them. And there's a lovely passage from Isaiah that's continuing along this idea of the stars being the angels of the Lord's kingdom. And it says, lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, referring to the stars, who brings out their host by number. He calls them all by name. Of the multitude of the mighty and powerful in strength, not a man is missing. A couple more along these lines. He who dwells in the secret place of the Most High shall abide under the shadow of the Almighty. I will say of the Lord, He is my refuge and my fortress, my God, in Him I will trust. Surely He shall deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the perilous pestilence. He shall cover you with His feathers, and under His wings you shall take refuge. But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me, and my Lord has forgotten me. Can a woman forget her nursing child and not have compassion on the son of her womb? Even they may forget, but I will not forget you. See, I have inscribed you on the palms of my hands. And these are just samples from the multitudes of teachings in the Word that are covering these ideas. This is the message that the Lord wants us to get above all others, that we're safe with Him and He will never forget us. We'll never be left out of His plan. And so, coming back to the beginning, the Lord foresees the kind of life that we're going to lead, and He orders our steps. If we're willing to let Him lead us, He orders our steps for us. And though we fall, which we all do, we shall not utterly be cast down, for the Lord upholds us. Those of us who are willing to follow Him. Got a plan for us. And yes, misfortune might befall us, but the Lord's still right there. And to come back to this idea, the Lord says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a copper coin, and not one of them falls to the ground apart from your Father's will, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. He knows you that much detail. And of course, the point is, do not be afraid, for you are of more value than many sparrows.